I'm going to hit the recording button. There we go. And welcome to the North Central Climate and Drought Outlook for March 2025. And my name is Doug Cluck. I work for NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And today we're going to hear from Matt Siddle, who is with the Kansas State Climate Office there, Kansas Assistant State Climatologist. So Matt, why don't you, before I say that, if you have any questions as we go through this, or if you have comments or whatever, put them in the question box, if you will, and we'll get to those at the end. I'll try to answer some of those along the way, but we're not being joined by Dennis Toddy today from USDA, so we'll do the best we can in answering some of the questions that he would normally answer. Yeah, so Matt, why don't you take it away and I'll be quiet. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Doug. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. Just want to make sure before I start talking that everyone can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're joining us from the West Coast. This presentation is a collaborative effort of the agencies that you see listed on your screen. We're glad that you could join us today and hope that you'll join us every month on the third Thursday. Our next presentation after today will be April 17th, and Dennis Toddy will be our presenter then. And if you'd like to look at this or any previous presentations, there are a couple of links on your screen. I'll show those again at the end of the presentation where you can go back and look at those. And as Doug mentioned, if you've got any questions, please utilize that questions window either during or after the presentation. Here's the outline of what I'm going to talk about today. We're going to start by looking back at past weather, not only for the month of February, but also for the meteorological winter of 24 and 25, which is the 3 months of December, January, and February. We'll take a look at the temperature and precipitation rankings for both of those periods. We'll also look at seasonal snowfall, talk about some notable events that have occurred here in the last month, and a couple of those were just here in the last week. Also, we'll take a look at future weather and climate outlooks. We've had some that were just released this morning, so they're hot off the presses, and we'll take a look at those. We'll also talk about the river flooding outlook, take a look at the drought conditions, and our ENSO forecast. Let's start by taking a look at the temperature rankings from our friends at the National Centers for Environmental Information for the month of February. You see numbers here. The lower the number you see on the screen, the colder that it was in the month of February. And you'll take a look at the eastern half of our north central region. Most of those numbers are in the 60s and 70s, fairly close to normal. As you go further west, you can see between the states of North Dakota and Kansas, the light blue shading indicates where it was below normal. But if you go even further west, the state of Montana up there, that number 13 means it was the 13th coldest February in 131 years of record keeping from NCEI. And if we break this down into individual counties, you can see specifically where in Montana the cold air was. In fact, if we take all of the counties in the lower 48 and rank them from most below normal to most above normal, the top 20 of those most below normal counties are all in the state of Montana. Now, surprisingly, if you go 2 states to the south into Colorado, the one county that was the most above normal in the lower 48 was Alamosa County, Colorado. So had quite a range of conditions across our western half of our north central region. And as it turns out, there were a few locations that had a top 10 coldest and a top 10 warmest February. On the left, you see Billings, Montana leading that list. Their average temperature for the month of February was a full 14 degrees below normal. Meanwhile, Alamosa and Leadville, Colorado had their warmest February on record. Alamosa, the warmest in 93 years of record keeping, nearly 10 degrees above normal. A couple of additional statistics to point out. Billings for the period February 2nd through the 21st averaged 4 degrees Fahrenheit. It was almost 25 degrees below normal. There was warming at the end of February that brought that normal for the month back up to 15. But that 20-day period ended up being the coldest 20 days in Billings since the year 1996. We contrast that with Grand Junction, Colorado, where there were 8 days in February with a high of at least 65 degrees, and that's the most that they've ever recorded in the month of February. The previous record was just 4 such days in 1995. On average, Grand Junction only has a 65-degree reading or higher once every 4 years. So having 8 in the month of February is certainly very unusual. This map I wanted to show you here shows the rankings of not only the towns we just mentioned, but additional towns. And where you see the purples and the blues in eastern Montana, you see that Billings was not alone in having a highly ranked below normal February. Whereas if we look in western Colorado, you can see the red numbers there. Those are rankings for the warmest February on record. And the line that's in between there really parallels the Rocky Mountains. So areas to the east of the Rocky Mountains in Montana, well below normal, where areas to the west, the western slope of Colorado, were much warmer than normal. Now, on the east side of the Rockies, the main event that led to this bitter cold temperatures and those rankings that we see there was an Arctic outbreak that lasted from roughly the 11th through the 21st of February. And this is the departure from normal, courtesy of our friends at the Midwest Regional Climate Center. And you can see the dark purples there across eastern Montana, the western Dakotas down into Nebraska. Those are locations that averaged 25 degrees or more below normal for that 11-day period. And if you'll note in western Colorado, you actually see some areas that were slightly above normal during this time because of that cold air moved south, stayed east of the Rockies, was not able to be lifted, so it didn't cross over into western Colorado. And of this cold air, the coldest reading, Huntley, Montana, which is very close to Billings, 48 below zero. That was the coldest temperature during this Arctic outbreak, and that occurred on February 18th. And in addition to that one reading, there were a few locations that set record lows for the month of February, listed here, including Circle, Montana. Dickinson, North Dakota, you'll note, has an asterisk next to it. That's the coldest temperature ever recorded at Dickinson. By 1 degree, they set a new record at 36 below zero. Valentine, Nebraska tied their monthly record. And here in Manhattan, Kansas, our airport reached or felt a minus 21 on February 20th. That tied the all-time record low. In all, in terms of daily record lows, over 1,200 record lows were set in the north central region between February 11th and the 21st. So very cold, significant outbreak of Arctic air. What was interesting is immediately after that Arctic outbreak, temperatures warmed up dramatically. And as a result, at the end of February, we went from locations that were well below zero, and 5 to 9 days later, we're up into the 50s, 60s, and even 70s. And if we look at the difference between the lowest temperature and the highest temperature in the late February period from the 18th through the 27th of February, Broken Bow, Nebraska, right there in Custer County in central Nebraska, was minus 35 on the 20th, warmed all the way up to 70 degrees on the 26th. That was a difference of 105 degrees. It seemed that Nebraska was really the center point of where we had these triple-digit differences, because you see Valentine and McCook also on this list, but they were not alone in having such dramatic differences. You can also see locations in South Dakota, Montana, as well as Kansas and their Bismarck, North Dakota, a 95-degree difference over a period of just 9 days. Let's shift gears now. We've looked at temperature. Let's talk about precipitation. Again, we'll start with the precipitation rankings. On this map, the lower the number, that indicates the drier than normal that state was during the month of February. And you'll see it in a lot of the north central region. We see numbers that are fairly small, which means it was below normal for precipitation. There are a couple of exceptions in our region. Specifically, we look at the states of Montana and Wyoming. Those numbers are over 100. That indicates above average. The highest number that you see in our region is the state of Kentucky. That number 123 indicates that it was the 9th wettest February on record. Again, if we bring this down to the county level, you can see a little more resolution and say, well, what parts of these states contributed the most to either being much above or much below normal. And there's 3 locations that I wanted to highlight, 2 of them above normal and 1 of them below normal. We'll take a closer look now at each one of those, starting with the state of Kentucky. And you'll see that this is the total precipitation for the month of Kentucky, or excuse me, for the month of February for the state of Kentucky. And across the southern half of the state, on the 15th and 16th, there was an event that produced 4 to 6 inches of rain. And by month's end, the state averaged 7.29 inches of rain, more than double the normal for the month of February. And if you look in southeastern Kentucky, in the coalfields region, there are some counties that had over 9 inches of precipitation. Harlan County had the highest total, 9.83 inches. That ended up being the 4th wettest February in that county. Again, that's over 131 years of data from NCEI. So very unusual to have that much precipitation in the month of February. We contrast that going further west to the state of Minnesota. And you'll see here, there are some counties that are brown in color. There are some that are a dark brown. Those 2 counties right there in the state of Minnesota had their driest February on record. Those counties are Pennington and Red Lake. Pennington, Thief River Falls is located in Pennington County, had on average 1/100th of an inch of precipitation for the month of February. And it turns out in Thief River Falls, they've only had 5/100ths of an inch of precipitation all year. So the deficit that they've had into January and February has continued on into the month of March. And if we look at the 2 months of January and February combined, there are currently 8 counties in Minnesota, including the 2 that are illustrated here, that are experiencing their driest start to a year. So very unusual conditions there. Finally, let's go 2 more states to the west. We've got to cross over North Dakota to get to the state of Montana. And what we see here are a number of counties in the green. So much wetter than normal conditions were experienced in Montana. And we take a look at some of the snow totals. Billings, Montana, 30.7 inches of snow in February. That's their 3rd snowiest February on record in 91 years of data. And you remember also that we talked about Montana being, or Billings being 14 degrees below normal for the month of February. Well, part of that reason was because they had 31 inches of snow. So deep snowpack, which contributed to having much colder conditions. And of course, in addition to that Arctic outbreak that we saw in mid-month. A little bit further west, Missoula had 23.7 inches of snow. That was their 3rd snowiest February also in a 78-year period of record. Now, let's take a look at February and the 2 months that precede that, December, January, and February, what we call meteorological winter. And if we take a look at the temperature rankings for all of the counties in the United States, focusing, of course, on the North Central region, we see a lot of the counties across the Dakotas and the Great Lakes region slightly above normal for that 3-month period. Also, most of the state of Wyoming and the western parts of Montana. You will see, however, there are a few counties scattered in there that are shaded in blue. And those are locations that were below normal for the winter. And of those counties that you see there, 28 counties in all here in the state of Kansas had a below normal February, or excuse me, below normal winter. And Barton County, where Great Bend is located, ended up having the largest negative departure of any county in the United States, in the lower 48 at least, 1.7 degrees below normal for the entirety of the 3-month meteorological winter. And one of the reasons for that was we had a number of snow events that led to keeping snow on the ground for a long time, which helped to keep temperatures very cold. Now, speaking of the 3-month meteorological winter, let's take a look at precipitation as well. And we see here, upper Midwest, there are a lot of counties that were below normal. We see, of course, those 2 in Northwest Minnesota that we talked about before, but there's parts of Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, Nebraska, where we see much below average conditions. And you might note that we got Minnesota and Kentucky there, which are above normal, but there are a couple of, or one county, excuse me, in western Colorado that is the record driest. It turns out that Montrose, Colorado, Montrose County, had their driest winter on record with 1.34 inches of precipitation averaged across that county. The previous record was 1.58 inches in 1954. So not only was it very warm in western Colorado, it was also very dry, because we see all of those counties from Grand Junction through Montrose down to Cortez and Durango much below average for meteorological winter. What about snowfall? Let's take a look at that map. This is the accumulated snowfall beginning from October 1st through March 18th, 2025. Unfortunately, this does not have the blizzard snowfall from yesterday. There are some technical issues going on with the mapping software. Was unable to get that. I do apologize. But this map illustrates total snowfall for that period. And we see a lot of greens there. And if we look at the color table below that map, we see light green is 10 to 20 inches, and then the darker greens mean more precipitation. But the majority of our north central region is dominated by a couple of colors. It's really more helpful when we have a map like this to look at the departure from normal. And when we take a look at that, well, we see there is clearly a snow deficit in Minnesota, the Dakotas, northern Iowa. That really stands out on this map. But we're talking between 20 and 40 inches below normal. Otherwise, we look down to the south. Kansas, Missouri, southern Illinois, and Indiana, and the state of Kentucky, above normal snowfall for the meteorological winter. And of course, up in the state of Montana as well, and Billings in particular, which we've talked about already, above normal precipitation, above normal snowfall. We can take a look at a few winners and losers from the winter of 2024-25. These locations on the left have the number you see there is the meteorological winter snowfall. The following number after that is the departure from normal for that winter. Topeka tops this particular list. Granted, I handpicked a couple of these just to point out that there are some locations that were well above normal for snowfall, including Evansville, and slightly above normal for Kansas City and for Springfield, Missouri as well. On the other hand, the snowfall deficits are larger in magnitude, starting with Madison, Wisconsin, who's only seen 21 inches of snow. You would not normally expect Topeka to have, or Kansas City to have more snow than Madison, Wisconsin, but as of right now, that's how it stands. 26 inches below normal. Fargo, Chicago, Minneapolis, also around 20 to 25 inches below normal for the snowfall totals. Now, if we take a look at the accumulated snowfall, especially in the mountainous areas, we see on this map the snow water equivalent of the snowpack that it currently exists in these areas. And I put a rectangle there just to focus your attention on those parts of the north central region. And really, it's very interesting that most of these divisions are very close to 100% of normal. You see parts of the North Platte Basin there in southeast Wyoming, exactly 100% of normal. There are some exceptions, though. One of them is southern Colorado. We see numbers below 100%, and that corresponds to, as we saw, Montrose being having a very dry winter. That's illustrated here, and even further south into New Mexico, very dry there. But into eastern Montana, the Missouri River Basin, also we're seeing some lower numbers to the west, higher numbers to the east. And we can take a look at the overall Missouri River Basin on the next slide here. This particular graphic here, the two plots show the snowpack water content above Fort Peck, which is in Montana, and then the second one shows the total from Fort Peck, Montana, downstream to Garrison, North Dakota. The percent of normal at both locations, or both collective areas, stands at 92% of normal. The red line there illustrates normal snowpack, and that curve peaks in mid-April. So depending upon what happens here in the next month, if there's additional snowfall that occurs in those areas, there is certainly time for those to increase. These are higher numbers than we had last year. You may recall that the percentages were a lot lower last year. If we switch over to the Platte River Basin, these numbers are very close to normal, especially the South Platte River. It's 101, or excuse me, that South Platte Basin. It's sort of an integrated area across the river there. 96, 101% of average. So doing really well there, close to normal, definitely better than we were last year. Another area that we want to look at in terms of ice coverage, that's the Great Lakes. Now, you might recall last year when we looked at this graphic that we were in the midst of the lowest percent ice coverage on record, dating back to 1973. This year, somewhat better news. You can see that even though we are below normal now, there were a couple of periods where we were at or even above normal. And you see a peak there in late February. Not surprisingly, that coincides with the Arctic air outbreak that we talked about earlier. And then we can see that the warm up that we had at the end of February brought the ice coverage. This is the collective ice coverage, mind you, of all the Great Lakes combined, as well as Lake St. Clair, dramatically dropped. And it's continued to drop as we've moved into the month of March. Why is that? Well, it turns out that so far in the month of March, This is the departure from normal for average temperature for the first 18 days of March. And you see a predominance of orange shading there. That's roughly 5 to as much as 10 degrees above normal. It has been quite a warm March so far. And we see some areas from the western Dakotas into western Minnesota that are running over 10 degrees above normal. As a result, with these warm temperatures, we have seen a dramatic decrease to a complete eradication of the frost depth in especially the southern locations here. And we've also seen soil temperatures have warmed up quite a bit. And on this next graphic, we can see as of March 16th, the average soil temperatures across the north central region. And one of the things we see is to the north, it's still below freezing or right at freezing in many cases across the state of North Dakota. This data from the NDAWN, the North Dakota Mesonet. Further south, you can see much warmer temperatures. And in fact, there are some areas that are currently at or above 50 degrees in terms of soil temperature averaged across, say, the Kansas Mesonet. In southern Kansas, we're at slightly over 50 degrees right now. So that's good news for folks who are considering planting. 50 degrees being a typical temperature where there's plans to go ahead and plant corn. Granted, this time of year, if you plant, there's always going to be the risk of a freeze, but with soil temperatures at 50 degrees, we don't expect, at least in Kansas, to see a frozen ground again. We're at the time of year now, as we've moved it later into the month of March, that our average normals are near freezing. So should be good news there. We should be moving forward. As areas further north, those will continue to increase in the coming days and weeks. And we'll talk about the outlook for the months of April through June, and we'll see just how quickly it may be warming up there. Another thing that we experience in spring, this is the spring leaf index, and the leaves that it's referring to are specifically lilac and also honeysuckle. In this map, anywhere you see a green shading, that's a location that is seeing leafing earlier than normal. And right now, in the state of, or southern Iowa rather, this particular graphic indicates that it's very early. Perhaps this is the earliest of in 10 years. I don't know if that's specifically true, but the main takeaway here is that as you're moving north, we expect these things to leaf out. And the furthest north where the leafing out is occurring right now would be across Nebraska, Missouri, Illinois, and that leaf out is ahead of normal. Want to switch gears here. Let's talk about some of the notable events that have occurred across our north central region in the past month since our last presentation. We're going to go in chronological order for these events, and the first one I want to start with occurred on February 24th in northeastern South Dakota. It was the earliest tornado on record in the state of South Dakota. Not only was it the first February tornado, there are no tornadoes on record in the month of January in South Dakota either, so this particular event stands as the earliest tornado on record there. Unknown EF rating, there was no damage. You can see it appears to be over a fallow field. So fortunately, we don't need to worry there about any kind of damage. Very interesting. We don't expect tornadoes that early. We'll take a little step forward in time. We want to look at March 10th, and there was a very large wildfire that occurred in the Cheyenne River Reservation in western South Dakota. This fire began on March 10th, and there were 3 individual fires that merged into a single fire, and the overall area impacted was about 34,000 acres. And the breadth of that fire was a 17-mile length of fire at one point. Fortunately, as of March 18th, that fire is 95% contained. So that's a little bit of good news. In the picture that you see on the screen there, you can see one of the tribal communities there that was surrounded by fire, but they were fortunate to be able to keep that fire from impacting the buildings in that community. March 14th, that was a very significant weather event. You remember a very strong low pressure system formed in the state of Colorado originally, and it moved to the east through Kansas and then up northeast up into the state of Minnesota. But one of the very unfortunate impacts of that low being so strong was a strong pressure gradient led to very high winds and a dust storm occurred in northwest Kansas, just to the east of Goodland on Interstate 70. And there was an accident that involved 71 vehicles. And unfortunately, there were 8 fatalities as a result of that accident. At the time of the accident, our mesonet sites, we have one in Goodland and we have one in Colby, which are about 20 miles on either side of where this accident took place. 2-meter winds were averaging 38 miles per hour at the time. And along with that, there was a dry relative humidity of 25%. So unfortunately, those conditions were perfect for the combination of the dust and the wind to create visibility issues, which led to that tragic accident. Speaking of the dust, this is a really interesting satellite picture that the National Weather Service in Lubbock posted on their webpage. The areas in brown that you see, that's dust. That dust was being lifted from eastern New Mexico and across the South Plains of Texas and up into Oklahoma. And then you can see it into eastern Kansas. And behind the low, that dust was wrapped around and came back through western Kansas. And you can even see right there in northwest Oklahoma and south central Kansas, you can see the center of that low pressure system. So that storm was so strong, it wrapped all of that dust around. And that dust is what led to that accident in northwest Kansas. Now here in Manhattan, we had rain showers and it was mixed with dust. So really kind of an unusual thing. It left a number of dots. Every car in Manhattan looks like it's polka dots with the coverage of that dust from that event. If we take a look later that evening, you can see the low pressure system in the center of it was around Sioux City, Iowa at that point. But ahead of that low, we had an outbreak of severe weather. And this was about, says 10:45 p.m. Central Time. There were a number of supercells that had formed and running from St. Louis down to around Poplar Bluff and towards Little Rock. And unfortunately, there were a number of strong tornadoes that occurred. The first column, or excuse me, the first row that you see here, that's the average number of tornadoes that we expect in the states of Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana during the month of March. That's the entire month of March, mind you. Second row, that's how many tornadoes. As of now, it's still a preliminary count because the storm surveys are still ongoing. There are 18 confirmed tornadoes so far in Missouri and 18 in Illinois, 8 in Indiana. So those counts from a single severe weather outbreak are 3 to 4 times greater than the normal amount we would see for the entire month of March. So we're definitely an early start for severe weather in these areas. Sadly, in Missouri, 12 fatalities occurred in conjunction with these tornadoes. And it turned out from a standpoint of tornadoes, this was the deadliest day in Missouri for tornadoes since May 22nd, 2011. And that was the Joplin EF5 tornado that killed 158 people. So this was a very serious event. 7 of those tornadoes that we talked about were rated EF3. So really strong tornadoes. Some of those had long tracks in excess of 20 miles. So a powerful low pressure system brought dust to one part of the country and brought severe weather to another part. Now, here's an image of the tornado damage as seen in Illinois. This is the town of Neoga. And there was an EF2 tornado that occurred there. And you can see this particular house sustained a lot of damage. You can see it looks like sheet metal wrapped around the tree there. So Missouri was not the only state that was impacted by the tornadoes. Now, just yesterday, we had another strong low pressure system that moved through somewhat of the same areas that were impacted on the 14th. And this storm produced heavy snow in the state you see there, initially in the state of Kansas here to the west of us in Manhattan. That area of heaviest snow tracked north and east from here through eastern Nebraska up into northern Iowa and on into Wisconsin and to the UP of Michigan. One of the areas that was arguably the most hardest hit was the Omaha metro area. And OPPD, which is the electricity provider for Omaha and surrounding communities, had 106,000 customers that were without power at the height of the storm. And you can see the picture in the lower right. That was taken in the metro Omaha area. A lot of power poles were snapped because of winds gusting as high as 74 miles per hour. You see that at the Lincoln Airport. We had gusts here in Kansas as high as 80 miles per hour. And similar to the event on the 14th, we also saw tornadoes ahead of the low pressure system. There were 9 reports of tornadoes in Illinois. So far, I'm not sure of the strength of those. The surveys have not been released yet, but definitely another dynamic system. And this is the time of year that we see these dynamic systems. So we've had back-to-back two lows that caused a variety of conditions across our region. Now, are we going to have more of these? Well, let's take a look. Let's go into the outlook section of our presentation today. We're going to start with the precipitation outlook for the next 7 days. This takes us from 12Z this morning on the 20th through the 27th of March. And we see dry conditions for a number of areas. Nebraska, Kansas, a lot of Colorado, including western Colorado. That's not good news because they could really use some precipitation. We don't see anything in the short term there. There is the possibility of some improvement to the deficits in precipitation in the arrowhead of Minnesota and also northern Wisconsin, the UP of Michigan. There's a potential for a snow event that would be most likely late in the weekend. And looking at the European model, it's possible there could be as much as a foot of snow that takes place in the UP of Michigan. Now, granted, UP of Michigan experiences a lot of snow every year, but for places such as northern Wisconsin, where they're 20 plus inches in arrears, any snow would be welcome at this point. If we take a little bit further ahead look, we're going to go down to the 8 to 14 day outlooks for both temperature and precipitation. And the thing that stands out here on this map is the predominance of above normal temperatures, probabilistic likely conditions for above normal across the states of Kansas as well as Colorado. And we look at the color table. Granted, it's a bit small to read down there, but those correspondence, the darker reds indicate likely above normal temperatures for that area. Further north in the upper Midwest, we do see the chance of below normal conditions. That would again be potentially after snowfall. I don't know if that reflects the potential for the snow cover on the ground at this point, but again, above normal, above even chances, if you will, of below normal temperatures in the Great Lakes region. How about precipitation? Well, near normal for some areas, such as here in the state of Kansas. Most of the north central region is predominantly slightly above normal probabilities for above normal precipitation. But granted, those probabilities are ranging from 33 to 40%. So we wouldn't consider those to be massively high probability. So it's not likely that there's going to be a very heavy precipitation event. There's just a slight tendency towards expecting above normal precipitation. If we take a look now at the monthly outlooks for the month of April, these were just released this morning. And the main thing we see here is above normal probabilities. Now, granted, this is in the southern part of the US, so we see equal chances for most of our area, but the pattern we see here that is the signature, if you will, of a La Niña pattern. And we have been in La Niña during this winter, and the forecasters at the Climate Prediction Center who generated these products feel that there is the potential for a continuation of La Niña conditions a bit further into the future than they initially thought there was going to be. So this map reflects the likelihood of above normal temperatures in the southern U.S. This is what we expect to see during La Niña conditions. And you'll note that that does include western Colorado, where we've already seen how warm and how dry it's been there. And unfortunately, when we take a look at the precipitation outlook for the month of April, we see there is an above normal chance, above or higher probabilities, if you will, for below normal precipitation in western Colorado again. We don't like to see that because as we continue into the spring months, average precipitation increases. And if we have these deficits where we're not getting adequate precipitation, we do run the risk of drought conditions becoming more serious. There is some good news, at least for areas around Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana. They have slightly elevated probabilities of above normal precipitation. All those areas in the white, equal chances. That's equal chances of 3 different possible outcomes. That's above, below normal, and near normal. Now, we just referred a little bit to La Niña. Let's take a look at the La Niña forecast. Excuse me. I'll look at that in a minute. Before we do that, let's take a look at the seasonal temperature outlook. That's for the months of April, May, and June. And we see the influence, at least of the April outlook and the above normal temperatures that we saw on our previous map. And that is, again, the impact of La Niña, or at least the potential for La Niña conditions to persist a bit longer than was forecast, say, 2 months prior to this. In terms of precipitation, the seasonal map does look a lot it's somewhat similar to the one that we saw for the month of April, but that bullseye of below normal precipitation, elevated probabilities is unfortunately, it's again right over western Colorado. So it's not good news in terms of the outlooks at this point for those areas on the western side of the Rockies that are already below normal. It appears that the departures from normal may increase over time as we move further and further into the spring. Now, we'll talk about the ENSO forecast that I was referring to just a couple of minutes ago. What we see here, we see three different colors of histogram bars. Where you see the blue, that's the probability of La Niña. The gray bars, that indicates neutral conditions, neither La Niña nor El Nino. And then the red bars, that indicates El Nino. Right now, we see the seasons across the bottom of the screen. FMA, that refers to the months of February, March, and April. Right now, while this graphic shows the highest probabilities of us transitioning from La Nina into neutral conditions, again, the forecasters at the Climate Prediction Center think La Nina may hold on a little bit longer than initially expected. So while it appears that the probabilities of La Nina are low here, we're still in a La Nina event at this current time, and there is a La Nina advisory that is still in effect. As we go later on into the summer and fall, the probabilities become not as high because it's a longer forecast lead. There is more uncertainty, but there is the potential, if you follow just the La Nina bars, for potentially La Nina conditions to return by the fall. But at this point, we're still 6 months out. We want to focus more on the short term. And it appears at this point, La Nina may persist for a little while longer, with the likelihood of transitioning eventually to neutral conditions, but the timing on that may be a bit different than what we see here. Now, let's also take a look at our drought monitor. This is the drought monitor map for the north central states that was issued just this morning. And we see, you look across this map, there's only one state in our north central region that is completely drought free. That's the state of Kentucky right now. And the reason for that, as we spoke about earlier, was very heavy precipitation in the state during the month of February. For the rest of the states there's at least some part of the states that has a shading here. The darker shading refers to more severe drought conditions. The largest area of the most serious drought conditions is the D3 area that extends from roughly Cheyenne, Wyoming, up through Chadron, Nebraska, and over to around Winter, South Dakota. That area is in D3. And that part of the states, or excuse me, the multiple states there, you look at southeast Wyoming. If you look at the past 12 months for southeast Wyoming, this is running between the 6th and the 8th driest on record. So there's been a prolonged period of below normal precipitation in this area, which has led to the severity of the drought conditions increasing over time. Now, right now, 28% of the area you see on this map in the white, that's drought free. Anywhere that's roughly a tan color or brighter, that's 49% of the north central region is currently in D1 or worse conditions. If we take a look at how this map has changed in the last year, this is the 52-week change. So we're comparing March of 24 to March of 2025. And we see on this particular map that that area that stands out again is that same area in southeast Wyoming through the Nebraska Panhandle into South Dakota. 4-class degradation. So we're talking about areas that were drought-free at this time last year that have come down 4 categories to D0, 1, 2, and now at D3. And in fact, a lot of what we see here, there's more areas of degradation in the last year, or at least in terms of comparing the conditions, than there were a year ago. There are some good news stories, such as the state of Iowa, which had quite a bit of precipitation during summer last year. But the majority of what we see here are worsening drought conditions. And comparatively, we were at 34% drought free last year at this time. We're at 20% now. More notably, we were at 31% of the north central region was in D1 or worse conditions in March of 2024. That number has increased to 49%. And we definitely have seen some increases here in just the last 2 weeks. So it's concerning, obviously, that we've got the conditions that we do now. The drought outlook that was issued today as well for the period from March through June is not particularly good news. Anywhere that you see a yellow shading here, that refers to a part of the country where drought conditions do not exist at the moment, but are expected to develop between now and the end of June. The areas in the dark brown, those are locations where drought is currently in existence and is expected to persist. And you see a large area in the Missouri River Basin through the Dakotas and Nebraska, where we don't expect drought conditions to improve, at least not through the end of June. Drought removal is possible, however, in southern Wisconsin as well as parts of Michigan. So some areas appear to have the potential for improving conditions, but for the areas that are primary areas of the Central Plains, moving into the Northern Plains, not particularly good news on this particular map. We'll have to wait and see how this all plays out, of course, because it's certainly possible that we get a heavy rain event in some part of this country that could improve conditions locally. So we just have to hope that that ends up being the case here. Speaking of the potential for heavy precipitation events, we want to conclude today by taking a look at the flood outlooks across this map. Of course, is across the country, but we do want to take a more focused look at the north central states. Anywhere that you see a square on this map, that indicates where there is the potential for flooding of some kind. If we take a kind of a zoomed in look at the Ohio River as well as the lower Missouri River and Mississippi River valleys, we see a number of squares that are either orange or red. Orange refers to the potential, it says specifically on this map, a 50% or greater chance of exceeding the stated flood level. So there's a 50% chance of minor flooding anywhere that you see an orange square. And you also see a few red squares scattered across, especially in the western half of Missouri. That indicates the potential for moderate flooding. Now, we want to be clear that we're talking about areas that are in drought conditions right now. So a lot of what we see here is not unusual in terms of the probabilities, because there is always some potential for heavy rainfall, for a system to come through and produce very heavy rain due to springtime thunderstorms. And that's really what this map reflects, is that potential for heavy rain and thunderstorms. It does not mean that moderate flooding is a given, or that there has been heavy rain somewhere and that there will be spring flooding. The probabilities, according to our friends who work in the River Forecast Center, say these are pretty standard probabilities, or in some cases lower than the normal probabilities. We see things like this every year, but we will again have to wait and see how this plays out in terms of whether or not the flooding is realized. And there's a lot of it is contingent, as I said, upon having an organized thunderstorm event that may drop heavy rain in any one of these areas. That is my last slide for today. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions or comments that you would like to address through email, you see my address as well as Dennis and Doug's emails on the screen. And we have a number of the government websites there, which you're always welcome to check out. They provide wonderful information. And again, if you'd like to go back and review this webinar or anyone that has been done before this, there are a couple of links there where you can find the archive for that. With that, I will throw it back to Doug.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Very nice, very complete. Just a couple things. Could you go back to the ENSO graphic that you had, please? The bar graph.
I shall. There we go.
Yeah. So one thing I just want to kind of clear up on this is that although La Nina is, so when we define La Nina, it's based on the ocean and equator. What happens is it may end according to what the temperatures are in the ocean and the pressure differences, but the atmosphere doesn't know that. So the atmosphere continues acting as if there were a La Nina still going on. Which that means is a lot of these maps that he showed after this or before this, I don't remember when, the outlooks still retain some La Nina features, like that warmth to the south and dryness actually over the four corners and into the southern plains. So one thing, yeah, go to the precipitation one, because I do want to draw some attention to this right here. for those people interested in, I'll say, any sort of the central and southern plains, this is pretty typical for our region to experience drier than normal conditions in the spring with a La Nina, or the after effects, if you will, of a La Nina. That's one. Two, that we don't have a good handle on what's going to happen with La Nina or El Nino, or neutral for that matter, as Matt said, beyond what's pretty much happening now into the next month. We usually have to wait till June sometime before we start seeing what will likely be happening. We'll have a better clue of what's going to be happening in June, and mainly for the fall into the winter. So we can't call it right now, but that's just some of the background for this kind of thing. Also, in the drought monitor, I think there were a couple states with no drought. When we show the drought monitor map, if you will, if you want to go to that, the whole yellow area is not in drought. It just lets you know. It's when it reaches the D1 level, which is that tan color, then drought, then it's officially in drought. The yellow is just sort of, hey, we're getting dry, we're noticing it. We want to put this on the watch level, if you will. Yeah, and then go to the flood maps real quick. The final, you can do national, or the zoomed in one is fine for the flood maps. Yeah, that was great. So the orange indicates that there's a greater, like Matt said, greater than 50% chance of minor flooding in those areas, and the red is moderate. Moderate flooding, and many of, not all, but many of those locations are sort of primed to flood anytime we get, let's say, 1, 2, 3 inches of rain, which isn't that unusual if you think about April, May, and June, right? April, May, and June tend to be our wettest time of the year for the most part, most of these locations, and inevitably, doesn't matter how dry it is, these places, some of these tributaries, and sometimes larger rivers can flood during this time of year. So there's not a lot of unusual heightened flood worry this year in most locations. That's probably the bottom line on this. Now to the questions. It was pointed out to me that it was 49 degrees in Harlem, Montana, 34 miles from the Canada border today. I just looked it up, and they've already warmed up to 52 degrees. So that's nice if you're up in near Canada. That's a nice temperature, I would assume. There was a question to me about what started the Cheyenne River fire, and it's still under investigation, according to an email that I just received when I asked someone that question. So that is the answer to that. Often, it doesn't take much when there's a 50-mile-an-hour wind, a cigarette butt, or even a down power line, which we've all heard of. Doesn't take much. Could be a spark off of a rail line. It's pretty interesting, all the different things that can actually start a fire. But again, 50-mile-an-hour winds, 40-mile-an-hour winds, doesn't really matter. Can get things going pretty quickly. It was pointed out that there were very large tornadoes also in Mississippi and other places around the same time last Friday, when that big system went through and caused all the damage. There were a lot more deaths, for example, than what we indicated in other states other than Missouri that week. A kind of a general question: has the tornado belt shifted to the south and east, and attributing it to warming and dryness changes or a jet stream shift? Yeah, there's a little bit of I won't say controversy, but that's still out for the scientists and researchers to do a little more study on. But what some of the things that we're finding in terms of severe weather is that maybe the severe weather season is a little longer or starting a little earlier than it used to. That's one thing that we're noticing due to basically warmer air being funneled north into winter and causing causing that, I guess you would say, conflict between the cold and the warm air. Is there, yeah, and there's some indication that the dry line, if you know what that means, moving further east and causing more severe weather earlier in the season, again, in that direction. But there's also people who say that the jet stream moving further north earlier in the season, you're going to have an earlier northern severe weather season. So I'd say that is still under investigation as well. Does the Yellowstone National Park issue any information in regards to drought? I don't know the answer to that, but I have driven around in a lot of national parks enough to know that they are very keen on when people can light fires and all that kind of stuff. So Forest Service as well as national park folks are very aware of how dry things are. And you'll see on their signs, among other ways, that there are restrictions for burning fires and or anything for that matter when conditions get really bad. When does persistent warmer, drier become the new normal? Well, that's a good question. So we do a new normal every 10 years. So Matt, I don't know if you want to talk about that, but every 10 years we recompute what is normal, quote unquote. And if you look at what is normal over time, you'll see that temperatures are getting warmer. Now, drier, I'm not going to go into that because it could be one way or the other depending on where you are. It can also depend on what season we're talking about. But generally speaking, yeah, temperatures are warming and the averages are too. So, okay, one, thank you for being precise and easy to understand, Matt.
Oh, thank you. One point I did want to make, Doug,
yeah, that
you were mentioning.
Yeah, there's a couple things I can't comment right now. I can't comment on staff reductions or anything else like that. Dry and windy start to spring. Oh, more land moving into drought. Well, I thought he was going to say more land moving from Oklahoma to Iowa or something like that, but that's definitely the case. Matt, I don't know if you want to talk about the amount of, I'm sure someone's computing the amount of earth that moved due to the high winds and such, and this is the time of year when that kind of happens. But go ahead. Do you want to say more about the dust?
The dust was not measurable here, so we were not able to put a ruler in the dust to measure that. I did want to go back for a second to talk about the normals that you were referring to.
Yeah.
One of the big things when we talk about, I used to work for NCEI back in the late 90s. And when we talk about the normals that are issued every decade, those are primarily temperature and precipitation normals because the Cooperative Observer Network across the country, those folks are measuring high and low temperatures and total precipitation. One of the things that they're not doing is measuring relative humidity or dew point and reporting that. The best way, I think, now to ascertain if there are changes to dryness or a predominance of lower dew points is through our mesonets, which have not been around nearly as long as the period of record for the Cooperative Observer. So it's really hard to get a long-term grasp on have dew points fundamentally change and it's drier than normal or warmer than normal. We can look at it in the short term. It's hard to, in the future, it'll be much easier to do. But right now, we still don't have that deep amount of data for a long period of record to get a really good idea as to, hey, has it changed between 80 to 2010, from 90 to 2020, from 2000 to 2030 when those next normals are released?
Well, yeah, and I'll just simply say that definitely temperatures are headed north, so to speak, and that what Matt's talking about, what I'm talking about when I say how wet or dry it is, if dryness increasing, I'm not talking about dew points. I'm talking about the actual precipitation on the ground. So that again really depends on where you are. So there are indications of both ways, to be honest with you. There's more aridity in some parts and more heavy rains and certainly higher precipitation totals. All right, let me get back to Doug's question here. Are there going to be occasional opportunities for prescribed burns in the Flint Hills I guess there's a whole bunch of things that matter with that, like, it has to be before green up. It cannot be windy or even breezy. Do you want to say anything about that? There will be opportunities, but I don't know when they're going to be. I'm not looking at the daily weather stuff. Matt?
Oh, that's very true, Doug. One of the things that I was looking at our Kansas Mesonet data yesterday was the windiest March day on record, and that's dating back to 1985 here in the state of Kansas. Our 90 Mesonet sites across the state recorded an average 2-meter wind speed yesterday of 20 miles per hour, which, if we look at all the days dating back to 1985, this was actually the second windiest day on record for the Mesonet. There was a date in 1996 that was slightly higher. And for the month of March so far, we are averaging, this is the windiest March on record dating back to 1985 through the 20th so far. We still got a few more days to go, mind you, to see whether or not we actually get that record. Typically in Kansas, the highest average winds are in the month of April, but March is second highest, if you will, and it's been very high because we've certainly seen, Kansas was not the only state. There have been red flag warnings and burn bans and fire weather advisories all across the central U.S. because of these low pressure systems and the very strong wind, because it is so easy to get a wildfire that spreads rapidly. And as Doug mentioned, until we get before the green up, we still got to be very careful at any point. So it's hard to say, are we going to have more strong lows? Are we going to, we don't see precipitation in the short term, but we'll have to see. We'll have to, hopefully there will be some time in there somewhere, but right now we're still trending much drier, as we've seen with the worsening of the drought conditions on the drought monitor here in the last couple of weeks across Kansas.
I think it depends on your timing, Doug, and if you can get the burn done in a certain 12-hour period between systems, more power to you. But I would pay very close attention to what the National Weather Service says in terms of outlooks for the next, 24-hour segments. And they do have a lot of information on the local sites in terms of fire potential and all that stuff. So, Dennis, yes, doesn't show drought in north central Montana, although you've had exceptional drought there. I don't know if we had a map that showed soil moisture up in that area, but there's some worry that in the 4 to 6 inch depths that we do have some dryness down there. When are the climate zones temperatures refigured growing zones? That's a great question for the USDA, and I wish Dennis were here. I don't know if Brad Rippey is still on and he wants to comment, but I don't have an answer at the moment. Let me see if Brad's on and he wants to say.
Those were updated. I want to say was it last year?
Yeah.
Well, there's been a very recent.
It's been a few years.
Okay.
I don't know, Brad. Do you want me to? Do you want to unmute you? I don't know if you want to say anything about that. Or comment. So yeah, don't know. Try to get back to you on that one, Glenn. But that's a good question. And that, it's 2 o'clock, and we are pretty much done with. Oh, there's Brad. Let me see if I can unmute him. Nope. Oh, he made it. Oh, hardiness zones were just dated in 2023. Okay, so probably nothing too soon, I would say. I don't know how often those are done. I think it's periodically, but not necessarily on a hard schedule. I could be wrong. Anyway, we'll be back in April. Hopefully, Dennis Toddy, USDA Climate Hub guy, director will be doing that talk. Thanks again, Matt, and thanks everybody else for sticking in there for as long as you did. I'm going to stop the recording and bid you all a fine spring day. Take care.